She was ready to say, "I do," when the Mafia Boss whispered, "Your groom is gone. I own you now." The hand on her neck wasn't Sarah's. Meredith looked up into the mirror and froze. A stranger stood behind her in the wedding dress fitting room. Charcoal suit, black ink crawling up his throat, eyes like a predator who'd already won. "Your groom isn't coming, Meredith," he whispered against her ear. That's when she saw the contract in his hand. Her name, highlighted in red, $5 million. She wasn't a bride, she was collateral. They say love can't be bought or sold, but they've never had a debt that could only be paid in blood. Her name was Meredith Cole, 24, waitress, 3 months behind on rent, and 30 seconds away from marrying the man she thought would save her from drowning. The vestry of St. Jude Chapel smelled like beeswax and old wood, like hope wrapped in tradition. Meredith stared at her reflection, hardly recognizing the woman in vintage lace. 10 years of carrying trays and scrubbing floors, and finally, she was getting out. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her veil. "Sarah, can you help me with this?" Her voice was high, breathless with nervous joy. "It's slipping." She didn't turn around. She was too busy imagining Marcus's face when he saw her walk down that aisle. Her stable businessman, her future, her escape. A hand reached out. But it wasn't soft, wasn't delicate. This hand was large, powerful, with fingers that moved with deliberate control. As he adjusted her veil, those fingers lingered on the nape of her neck, a touch that made every hair on her body stand on end. It wasn't comfort, it was ownership. "Sarah, you're making me nervous," she laughed, trying to break the tension. "Is Marcus ready? Is he—" She looked up into the mirror, and her world shattered. The man behind her wasn't Sarah. He wasn't a wedding guest. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car, tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. But it was the ink that made her blood turn to ice. Black shadows and sharp lines crawled up his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. The dragon mark of the Gwon syndicate, the signature of the man the city only whispered about in dark corners. Gwon Yiseo, the cold king. His obsidian eyes met hers in the reflection. He didn't smile, didn't explain, just watched her with the patience of a man who'd already won. "Who are you? Where's Marcus? Where's—" His hand tightened on her neck, not painful, just absolute. "Your groom isn't coming, Meredith." "What? He's late. He's always—" "He's gone." Yiseo's voice was velvet and ice. 15 minutes ago, with a suitcase full of my money and a head start he doesn't deserve. He pulled something from his jacket, a single sheet of paper. Even in the dim light, she recognized Marcus's handwriting at the bottom. Her name was highlighted in blood-red ink. Yiseo whispered, his thumb tracing her jawline. "He owed me $5 million, and when a man can't pay his debts in my world, he pays in other ways." The room tilted. He sold his car, his business, and when that wasn't enough, Yiseo's breath was hot against her ear. He sold the only thing he had left with any value. He sold you, Meredith, signed you over to me as collateral. "No!" She wrenched away, backing into the vanity. "This is insane! Marcus loves me. He wouldn't—" "Marcus loves a winning hand." Yiseo stepped forward, a predator closing distance. "He just didn't have one. The church is surrounded. Your friend Sarah has been paid very well to forget you exist. You have no one." She looked toward the door. Every instinct from 10 years of reading dangerous customers screamed at her to run. So she did.
She bolted for the hallway, her dress bunching in her fists, heels clicking against stone. "Sarah! Sarah, help me!" She burst into the foyer and stopped dead. 4 men in black suits, earpieces glinting, and Sarah, sweet, loyal Sarah, counting a thick stack of $100 bills. She didn't even look up. Yiseo emerged from the vestry, hands in his pockets, looking almost bored. "The jet leaves in 20 minutes, he said calmly. "Bring the bride." "No!" Meredith screamed, kicked, fought as a guard lifted her like she weighed nothing. Her veil tore, fluttering to the ground like a dying bird. "This is kidnapping! I'll call the police!" Yiseo finally looked at her, and when he spoke, his voice was colder than the marble beneath her feet. "I own the police, little pawn." He turned toward the waiting SUV, and as of 5 minutes ago, I own you.
The elevator ride was a silent ascent into a different kind of purgatory, the floor numbers ticking upward with a clinical digital pulse. When the doors slid open, they didn't reveal a hallway, but the heart of Gwon Yiseo's world. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and polished obsidian, stripped of everything but the essential. There were no family photos, no soft edges, only the cold gray skyline of the city bleeding through floor-to-ceiling windows. Meredith stood in the center of the vast living area, her wedding dress a frantic white stain against the minimalist perfection. Her veil had been lost somewhere in the transit, leaving her hair tangled and her shoulders bare to the chilled air. Yiseo didn't offer her a seat. He moved to a bar made of seamless marble, pouring an amber liquid into a crystal glass with a precision that made her pulse jump. "I have $17,000 in debt," she said, her voice cracking before she forced it into the steady customer service tone she'd used on 1,000 difficult nights at the diner. "If I go back to work, if I take double shifts, I can pay you. I'm good for it. I've never missed a payment in my life. Just tell me who to send the checks to." Yiseo didn't look up. He swirled the liquid, the ice clinking like a funeral bell. "You're thinking like a waitress, Meredith. You're calculating tips and hourly wages." He finally turned, his obsidian eyes weighing her with a terrifying lack of emotion. "Marcus didn't owe me a credit card bill. He owed me $5 million and the integrity of my syndicate. You don't pay that back with double shifts and a smile." "Then let me go," she pleaded, stepping toward him, her lace train hissing against the stone floor. "I didn't sign anything. This isn't legal. You can't hold me for his mistakes." Without a word, he set his glass down and walked to a floating desk of dark wood. He pulled a single, heavy vellum sheet from a drawer and slid it across the surface. She looked down, her breath catching. It wasn't just a ledger entry. It was a formal transfer of guardianship, witnessed and notarized in a world that didn't recognize the police. Marcus's thumbprint was there, pressed in dark, dried ink. "In my world, this is the only law that matters," Yiseo said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate rasp that made her skin prickle. "He didn't just give me your debt, he gave me the rights to your life until I decide the balance is settled." She looked out at the city below, the lights shimmering like distant, unreachable jewels. From this height, people looked like ants, small and easily crushed. She wasn't in a home, she was in a high-altitude vault. The velvet-lined walls and expensive silence didn't change the reality. The white lace of her dress was no longer a symbol of a new beginning, it was a shroud. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, and the cold king was the only one with the key. Yiseo stood by the glass, his reflection superimposed over the sprawling city like a ghost haunting his own empire. He didn't look like a man who had just stolen a life. He looked like a man trying to keep a crown from slipping.
The silence of the penthouse was broken only by the soft hum of the climate control and the rustle of her ruined silk as she shifted her weight. "You think this is about money," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. He didn't turn around. "5 million is a rounding error in my accounts, Meredith. But perception is the only currency that keeps my throat from being slit in my sleep." She watched the way his shoulders squared beneath the expensive fabric of his suit. "I don't understand." "My cousin, Park Jin, is whispering to the board of elders. He tells them I've gone soft, that I've spent too much time in high-rise offices and not enough time in the trenches. He says a man without a legacy, without a bloodline to protect, has nothing to lose, and therefore nothing to lead." He finally turned, his gaze heavy and calculating. "In our world, a leader without a wife is a leader without a future. They see it as a vulnerability, a sign that I am a temporary fixture." She felt a cold prickle of realization. "You want me to be the legacy." "I want you to be the distraction," he corrected, stepping into the light. "I need a wife to show the elders that the Gwon line is secure, but more importantly, I need a pair of eyes that haven't been blinded by the politics of this house. There is a mole in my inner circle, Meredith. Someone is feeding Park Jin the details of my shipments, my movements, my life."
He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes traveling over her face with a clinical intensity. "You spent years reading people across a diner counter. You know the difference between a hungry man and a desperate one. You see the things my soldiers are too trained to notice. You help me find the traitor, and you play the part of the devoted bride for 6 months." The air felt thin. 6 months? 6 months of galas, dinners, and shared rooms. 6 months of being the woman who tamed the cold king. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a contract being signed in her blood. "At the end of that time, I'll hand you a check for $5 million and a new identity. Your debt will be erased. Marcus will be a memory. You walk away free." She looked at the hand he held out, the same hand that had adjusted her veil with such terrifying intimacy. It was a deal with a devil, but as she looked at the gilded cage around her, she realized the door was already locked. She could be his property, or she could be his partner. 6 months, she whispered, her voice shaking as she placed her hand in his. "And then I'm gone." 6 months, he agreed, his grip like iron. "But remember, Meredith, in this house, a lie is only a lie until you start to believe it." The dining room of the Gwon estate was a theater of shadows and silver, designed to intimidate as much as to nourish. Meredith sat at the right hand of the cold king, draped in emerald silk that felt like a second skin, though her soul was still wearing a grease-stained apron. The family dinner was an exercise in suppressed violence. 12 men, the elders of the syndicate, watched her with eyes that weighed her worth in blood and alliances. Across the table, Park Jin leaned back, his smile a serrated edge, as he watched Yisan command the room. To everyone else, this was a high-stakes summit. To Meredith, it was just another Saturday night rush at the Silver Spoon, only the customers carried Glocks instead of menus. She didn't watch the elders. She didn't watch the bodyguards stationed like stone gargoyles in the corners. She watched the unseen. She watched the way the wine was poured, the way the plates were cleared, and the subtle shift in the room's rhythm that only someone who had spent a decade in service would notice. When you are a waitress, you become invisible. People speak as if you are part of the furniture, and their bodies tell truths their lips would never dare. Yisan was deep in a discussion about shipping routes, his voice a steady, low hum that vibrated through her chair.
His hand rested near hers, his fingers occasionally brushing her knuckles in a rehearsed show of affection that made her heart stutter. Then she saw it.
Choi, Yiseo's personal secretary, stood just behind his shoulder. He was the shadow's shadow, diligent, quiet, and supposedly invisible. To the elders, he was a tool, but she noticed the way his thumb twitched against the side of his tablet every time Yiseo mentioned a specific coordinate. She saw the way his eyes didn't track the speaker, but rather the reflection of Park Jin in the mirrored buffet across the room. Most importantly, she saw the timing. A server entered with a fresh tray of crystal glasses. In the split second of the door's opening, the light hit Choi's face. He didn't look like a loyal servant. He looked like a man counting down the seconds until a bomb went off. He wasn't waiting for a signal from a bodyguard or an assassin in the rafters. He was the signal. As he reached forward to refill Yiseo's water, his hand hovered a fraction of a second too long near Yiseo's phone, a micro-expression of hunger that she'd seen 1,000 times in customers trying to slip a bill from a neighbor's table. The mole wasn't a soldier, it was the man who knew Yiseo's every breath. She felt Yiseo's hand tighten on hers, a silent question in the pressure of his grip. She didn't look at him. She leaned in, playing the part of the doting bride, and whispered against his ear. "Your secretary," she murmured, her breath hitching as she felt the heat of his skin. "He's not checking your schedule. He's checking the time for someone else." The adrenaline of the dinner had faded, leaving behind a silence that was thick and heavy with the weight of their secrets. They were back in the penthouse, the city lights below reduced to a shimmering carpet of cold fire. Yiseo had discarded his jacket, his silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the ink that crawled like a living shadow across his throat and disappeared beneath the fabric. Meredith stood by the window, still wrapped in the emerald silk that felt like a lie. "Choi didn't even flinch when you looked at him later," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's good." "He's desperate," Yiseo corrected, stepping into her space. He didn't stop until the heat of his body was a visceral pressure against her back. He reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of the emerald gown, but his gaze was on the reflection of her eyes. "Just like Marcus was, just like you were." She turned to face him, the distance between them dangerously thin. "I wasn't a gambler, Yiseo. I was a girl trying to survive a neighborhood that eats people like me for breakfast. My struggle wasn't a choice. It was the only thing I owned." He looked at her for a long moment, the obsidian hardness of his eyes softening into something she hadn't seen before, something that looked like recognition. He reached up, slowly pulling the collar of his shirt aside to reveal the base of the dragon's tail. It didn't just end, it merged with a jagged white scar that cut across his collarbone. "This ink isn't for decoration," he said, his voice dropping to a low, rough rasp. "Every line covers a mark left by someone who tried to take what was mine. My father, my brothers, my enemies. In my world, you either wear your history in ink or you let the scars tell the story of your defeat. I chose to turn my pain into a warning." She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the ink-stained skin just above the scar. The texture was different, raised and warm. "You've spent your whole life building a fortress out of yourself." "And you spent yours reading the room so you wouldn't get crushed by it," he murmured. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of sandalwood was overwhelming now, mixed with the salt of her own skin. "We aren't so different, Meredith. We both know debts are paid in blood, not promises." The hand that had once held a ledger of her debt now moved to the small of her back, pulling her flush against him. It wasn't the cold, proprietary grip of an owner. It was the heavy, desperate pull of a man who had finally found the only person he didn't have to lie to. When his lips met hers, the taste was dark and intoxicating, a different kind of heat that had nothing to do with the city lights and everything to do with the blurred line between captive and queen.
For the first time, she didn't feel owned. She felt seen. The call came at 2 in the morning, a jagged intrusion into the quiet of the penthouse. Meredith watched from the doorway as Yiseo took it, his back a wall of tense muscle, his thumb tracing the dark ink on his neck. "Where?" he asked, his voice like grinding stone. He hung up and reached for his holster, the leather creaking as he shouldered it. "Park Jin found him. Marcus is at the Obsidian. I'm ending this tonight." A cold, hollow feeling opened in her chest. It was too clean, too convenient. "Yiseo, stop," she said, stepping into the light. "Park Jin hasn't been looking for Marcus. He's been looking for a way to get you alone. This isn't a lead, it's a lure." He looked at her, his obsidian eyes unreadable, the hardness of the cold king back in full force. "I know," he said, softly, "but I don't leave debts unpaid, Meredith. Stay here." He vanished before she could protest, the heavy door clicking shut with finality. But Yiseo didn't realize that she knew the architecture of the underworld better than any bodyguard. She had spent 10 years working the service entrances and back alleys of places exactly like the Obsidian. She knew that behind every velvet curtain and gold-leafed wall lay a labyrinth of grease-slicked corridors, supply elevators, and hidden fuse boxes. She didn't call a driver. She grabbed a dark coat over her silk slip and took a taxi to the club's industrial rear. While the bouncers at the front were occupied with a line of desperate socialites, she slipped through the loading dock, blending into the kitchen staff. She moved with a phantom tray in her hand, her stride the practiced, invisible walk of a woman who had spent a decade being ignored. She reached the service gallery overlooking the private VIP lounge just as the room turned deadly. Below, Yiseo stood in a circle of 10 men, their hands moving toward their waistbands. There was no Marcus, there was only Park Jin, sitting on a velvet sofa, a silver pistol glinting in the strobe light. "You always were too sentimental about your property, cousin. Now the debt is settled in blood." She didn't wait for the first trigger pull. She knew the club's fire suppression system was linked to the main gas lines for the bar's pyrotechnics, a detail she'd memorized during a dozen safety briefings at the diner. She reached for the emergency release lever tucked behind a stack of crates. She yanked it. A deafening hiss exploded through the room as pressurized CO2 and white chemical foam flooded the lounge in a blinding cloud. The alarms shrieked, the emergency lights began a rhythmic, disorienting pulse, and the hunters were suddenly the blind. In the whiteout of chaos, she saw a familiar shadow move with lethal precision. She had provided the diversion. Now the cold king would provide the ending.
The chemical fog of the diversion was still clinging to the floor like a shroud when the guards dragged him into the center of the storage room. Marcus, the man Meredith had once dreamed of a white picket fence with, looked like a broken ghost. His wedding suit was stained with the gray soot of the ambush, and his eyes, once full of the lies she'd mistaken for love, were wide with a frantic, sweating terror. "Meredith, please," he sobbed, his voice a jagged rasp against the concrete. "I didn't have a choice. Yin Jin said he'd kill me if I didn't lure him here. I did it for us. I was going to come back for you." Yiseo stepped out of the shadows, his presence a dark weight that seemed to swallow the dim light of the overhead bulb. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at her. In his hand, he held a burner phone recovered from the floor, the screen still glowing with a string of texts to Park Jin. Marcus hadn't just been a gambler, he had been a willing participant. He hadn't just sold her life to cover a debt, he had tried to buy his own freedom by handing Yiseo's head to his cousin on a silver platter. The cold king walked toward her, his movements as fluid and silent as a shadow. Without a word, he reached into his holster and pulled out his sleek black pistol. He turned the grip toward her, the metal glinting with a cold, unforgiving light under the flickering industrial lamps.
He was the one who signed the ledger, Meredith, Yiseo said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. He traded your soul for a head start, then tried to bury us both to cover his tracks. The debt is yours to settle. Close the account. She looked down at the gun. It was heavy, a cold anchor that promised a final, bloody kind of closure. She looked at Marcus, who was crawling toward her feet, his face twisted in a pathetic mask of desperation. For a second, the rage was a wildfire in her veins, a decade of struggle, of serving others, and of being betrayed by the one person she thought was safe, demanding a voice. But as her fingers brushed the cold steel, she felt the difference between the woman she was and the woman Marcus thought she would always be. She wasn't a pawn anymore, but she wasn't a monster either. To kill him would be to let Marcus define her one last time. "No," she whispered, her voice finding a strength that didn't need a trigger. She stepped back, letting the gun remain in Yiseo's hand. "I've spent my whole life cleaning up other people's messes, but I won't stain my hands with him. Killing him makes me part of his story. I'm starting my own." She looked at Yiseo, meeting his obsidian gaze with a clarity that made the air between them crackle. "The debt he owes me is paid by the fact that I'll never think of him again. He's nothing to me now. But the debt he owes the syndicate," she paused, her voice hardening. "Handle it your way, Yiseo. Settle the ledger."
Yiseo's eyes flared with a dark, burning respect. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the partner she had become. With a sharp gesture, the guards hauled Marcus up by his collar, his screams echoing off the damp walls as they dragged him toward the waiting black SUVs. She didn't look back. The man she was supposed to marry was gone, and for the first time, the weight of the debt didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a crown. The great hall of the Gwon estate was a tomb of silence, the air thick with the scent of old wood and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. The 12 elders sat in a semicircle of shadows, their faces etched with the skepticism of men who had seen empires rise and fall on the strength of a single lie. In the center of the room stood Park Jin, his posture defiant, though the slight tremor in his hand betrayed the rot underneath. "The girl is a waitress, a pawn picked up from the gutter," Jin spat, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "And Yiseo has let her into the heart of the family. He is compromised. He is weak." Meredith stepped forward into the circle of light, the emerald silk of her gown whispering against the marble. She didn't look at the elders. She looked at Park Jin with the same clinical detachment she'd used to study a difficult customer at 3 in the morning. She wasn't the trembling bride from the chapel anymore. She was the woman who had spent a decade seeing what men thought was hidden. "You're right, Jin," she said, her voice steady and resonant. "I was a waitress, and because I was invisible, I saw everything. I pulled the burner phone and a small handwritten log from her clutch. I saw Choi, Yiseo's secretary, tracking coordinates on your behalf. I saw the way you signaled the ambush at the Obsidian using the mirrored buffet. And I have the logs of every payment you made to Marcus to ensure he stayed in debt, ensuring he would eventually sell me to Yiseo as a lure." She laid the evidence on the central table. The elders leaned in, their eyes scanning the records of a betrayal that had almost cost them their crown. The room shifted, a silent tectonic movement of loyalty. Yiseo stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his grip no longer proprietary, but supportive. The sentence was passed without a word spoken aloud. 2 guards stepped from the shadows, and Park Jin's face went the color of ash. He wasn't killed, that would have been too merciful. He was stripped of his name and exiled into the very gutter he thought she belonged in.
When the room cleared, leaving only the two of them in the fading light of the hall, Yiseo turned to her. He pulled the leather-bound ledger from his jacket and with a slow, deliberate movement tore the page with her name on it in half. "The 5 million is accounted for," he murmured, his obsidian eyes burning with a pride that made her heart stutter. "The contract is void. You're free, Meredith. There is a car waiting outside to take you wherever you want to go. A new life, a new name, no more debts." She looked at the torn paper on the floor, then up at the man who had seen the queen beneath the lace. She thought of the empty diner, the struggling neighborhood, and the man who had sold her. Then she looked at the empire they had defended together. She reached out, her fingers lacing through his, the ink on his skin warm against her palm. "The car can wait," she said softly. "I've spent my life being owned by someone or something. I think I'd like to see what it's like to own the room instead." She wasn't a line in a ledger anymore. She was the woman holding the pen. She chose to stay, not as property, but as the partner who would help the cold king keep his crown.